Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here on set with attorney Jessica Ramirez. And you know what we do here. We break down the biggest live trials and legal stories in the news today. Today, though, is going to be a little bit different. We have some major cases to recap and also some big legal stories to cover. So let's get started right now. First up, we have an interesting new trial that we want to preview for you that will be in jury selection today. And we could expect openings either tomorrow or Wednesday. This one's out of Tennessee, and it concerns Eric Boyd. He's facing 36 charges, including murder, in connection with the absolutely brutal slayings of 23-year-old Chris Newsom and 21-year-old Shannon Christian. The victims were attacked and kidnapped back on January 6, 2007, ultimately beaten, raped, and tortured. Newsom was killed and his body was set on fire. Christian's body was found wrapped in garbage bags and stuffed inside of a trash can. The details of what these two went through are, I'm just going to tell you, horrifying. We'll have an opportunity to talk more about it. Now, 4 other people were charged and ultimately convicted for the deaths of these 2 young people. Boyd himself was originally convicted in 2008 of 2 federal charges, including being an accessory after the fact for hiding the ringleader of this attack, and he's currently serving an 18-year prison sentence. However, his true involvement was always questioned. It was alleged that he was a much more active participant in what happened. Well, the grand jury seems to think that there was evidence to support that, because last year Boyd was indicted on murder, robbery, kidnapping, and rape charges. That's the trial that we're going to cover for you as soon as it starts up, and I have to tell you, it is going to be something to watch. And we want to switch gears and talk to you about a big update that happened over the weekend in one of our trials. We have a verdict in the Nicole Nachtman trial out of Florida. This is the trial of the young woman who was accused of murdering her mother and stepfather. As you recall, the state claimed that the defendant gunned down Miriam and Robert Dinas in cold blood, while the defense said that this woman suffered from severe mental illness, more specifically battered child syndrome, that she was psychologically abused by her mother for years. Well, after 12 hours of deliberation at 1 a.m. on Saturday morning, here's what the jury came back with. And she was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jessica, a 1 a.m. verdict. Do you usually see that?
No, it's not common at all. And I got to tell you, I do have a problem with it, because it's about justice and what's going on with the jurors. They must be tired. They want to go home. It's my understanding even the prosecutor said something to the judge, please, we got to get them out of here. And shortly after the prosecutor voiced his concerns, they had a verdict. Yeah,
the judge didn't want to intervene. And they even came back about 7 hours after the deliberation and said, look, what happens if we just come back and we're unanimous on one of the counts, but not the other one? And they also asked for what is the definition legally of the words consequences, psychotic break, psychosis, and insane, which seems to suggest they were at least thinking about what the defense's argument was there. But they came to a verdict hours later.
Yeah, they did, and the judge did say to go back to the jury, to the jury rules and look at the jury rules, and wouldn't give them any advice or any direction in the questions that they did ask. But again, I think in New Jersey that wouldn't happen. You would go home, you'd come back Monday fresh.
Do you think they felt pressured to come up with an answer shortly after this? Like you said, the prosecutor wanted them to go home. The judge said, no, keep going, and he didn't want to intervene.
Absolutely. I mean, just human nature. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. It's 12 o'clock. This is a huge deal. Juries really take this serious, and it's difficult stuff to look at the legal framework.
Well, look, this is a big case. You got 2 victims, really strange defense. Let's go back to the prosecution's closing argument here. And this is by Courtney Derry, one of the attorneys in this case. And you'll hear, if you're just joining us, this was the state's case. And obviously, the jury believed it. I mean, it's an interesting closing argument there, because it seems to suggest how ridiculous the nature of this attack was. And, you know, the idea was that she kills him first, then waits for the mother. Now, she claims that the prosecution presented evidence that she confessed, that the defendant confessed to her mother surprised her, and that she was caught up in this. I'm curious your thoughts on how the prosecution articulated this theory of what happened.
Well, I think what they're trying to prove is that she wasn't insane, right? This is what the crux of this case is, was she's using the insanity defense. So they're basically trying to prove how calculating she was. This is what she took. She planned, she lied and waited, she cleaned up, she had the mental capacity to, again, I don't understand what that has to do with her mental capacity. She was able to pull this 6-foot man and clean up. So it just goes to show, or what she's trying to prove, that she wasn't insane, she was a faker, and that she had all her mental being when she did this.
Now look, I know motive's not an element of a crime. I get it. They don't have to show it. They don't have to prove it. But it does help tell the story. And here, if you have somebody who's accused of murdering her mother and a stepfather, I'd like to know why. The idea here that's saying, well, she was failing in college and she couldn't secure housing. She was afraid of her mother, so she hatched a plot to kill her. Do you sink your teeth into that?
Well, definitely that's the state's argument, but I think that the defense, they tried to do a good job in proving the insanity defense. It's always very expert heavy. They provided proof, they provided their experts. Again, it's always very difficult, these insanity defenses. It's rarely used, it's rarely successful. Usually you do have to have some type of previous diagnosis. And here we didn't have the previous diagnosis. We had the experts basically interviewing the defendant. She is her own historian, and they did have collaborating evidence where she was odd, right? She had some social issues. She had crazy sleeping patterns. She wore heavy clothes during July. So there were some issues,
had
definitely.
Had a fascination with Japanese anime.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there was some evidence, again, but because an insanity defense is so expert heavy, none of those odd behaviors are really going to go to prove the insanity defense.
Yeah, I mean, how many cases do we cover where you could say the convicted murderers are a bit odd? But here's the other thing. You know, what, in your opinion, was the strongest piece of evidence that we saw in this trial? Was it the testimony of her brother, who gets on the stand and says that his sister confessed to him? I mean, what was the thing that stood out to you the most?
Well, I think that we know that she did it. That's not what she's not saying she didn't do it. She's just saying that she's not guilty because of her mental illness. So I think that all of it was compelling. Definitely her brother was very compelling, and that she confessed, and just a little bit of her background, and that she did have mental issues. But again, it was pretty much a straight win for the state. Again, I don't like insanity defenses. They're rarely ever successful, and I pretty much knew that if there's no previous diagnosis, she's toast.
Well, sometimes you got to work with what you have and what you don't have. So we're going to break down more of this case in the next hour. When we come back, more of the prosecution's closing argument. Stay tuned. Again, the jury thought all that was true. They said that this was cold, calculated, premeditated murder. But the question is that accurate, what this prosecutor just said? That, you know, she says we believe that she had a mental illness. We're not unsympathetic to that. But can you have a premeditated murder but still have the insanity defense? Because if she still thinks what she did was right, and she still thought it was the thing to do, and she couldn't control her behavior, you tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be for the defense to prove, and they tried. But again, because her actions, again, listen to what the prosecutor is saying. She was logical, she was rational, she was calm, and she was talking to her friends. She spoke to her friends, she spoke to her brother. She was not suicidal, which are all things that you have to look at the time, near the time of the crime, to see if the person had a mental breakdown. Again, it's very difficult to prove because we don't know what's inside someone's head. And how do you prove what's inside someone's head? So again, they're so difficult to prove. And I think that the prosecutor did a great job to say, we know that she was mentally ill, but still, she should not avoid prosecution because she didn't have a break in reality. And I thought that was a great line because she's still being sympathetic.
Right.
And again, it's her actions to the state were very rational and calm.
Look, the prosecution made a strong argument there, and if you were just listening to the prosecution, you would think, oh, it seems like a straightforward case. Jury deliberated for 12 hours. What were they deliberating on, you think?
Well, I think that definitely there was issues here with a woman that was mentally ill. We had collaborating witnesses, not just expert, but friends and her brother.
Was it sympathy too, you think? They just felt bad for her in a way?
That her friends felt bad for her?
No, do you think the jury said, well, maybe this was a girl who was psychologically abused for years, and obviously doesn't justify what she did, but maybe it does, that back and forth a little bit?
I think that the juries are wonderful, and they really are. They're very smart. They take their job very seriously, and I think that they were going through the factors. They were going through that jury sheet and really taking into consideration the case before them and taking both sides, exactly what a jury is supposed to do.
Right.
It's too bad that they were forced into a verdict.
Well, again, we're talking about the prosecution because this is the last thing the jury heard before they went to their deliberations. Well, one of the last. And really, if we go to the prosecution's rebuttal closing argument, this was the state's last attempt to convince this jury to convict Nicole Nachtman, and it worked. Let's listen to this rebuttal closing argument. So he's trying to downplay what this is about. The defense is saying this is odd, weird, psychotic, insane behavior. He's trying to say this is a woman who's trying to cover it up. What else is she going to talk about? Talks about things that are interesting to distract the conversation. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think it's interesting that he basically is saying because she was calm and was able to speak in a calm voice, she is not crazy. I think that sometimes the state or people want to see someone just completely incoherent. That is crazy. Again, it's a very difficult. They're saying mental illness. She did have mental illness, but she knew what she was doing, and the defense has to prove she had mental illness, had no understanding of the nature of the event, had no idea that she did wrong. And because of her actions, because she did A, B, and C, and D, she called her friends, she was calm, she was collected, she was able to speak in a coherent way, then she wasn't mentally ill.
If she didn't clean anything up, if she didn't deny what she did at the beginning, and she sat there right at the house and waits for the police to arrive and asks, oh, what are you guys doing here? That would have been a different situation, right?
It would have been a different factor, and then we would have to look at how she reacted when she was being questioned. Again, they're saying, well, she wasn't crazy, she was coherent, she wasn't mumbling, she was present, she knew that she was being questioned by police officers, so she's still not crazy.
Does it matter that there were two victims in the sense that if it was just her mother, you have a case where maybe, like he said, okay, maybe self-defense applies there, it didn't apply in Robert's case. He was more of a surprise attack. She wasn't expecting it. If you just have the mother as the victim and not the stepfather, would that have changed the outcome of this case?
That's a very interesting question. Probably so. I didn't hear much violence coming from, or any evidence of violence coming from the stepdad. Basically, the case revolved about regarding the mom and how the mom physically and mentally abused her daughter. So I think that would have been a very interesting factor.
Now, Jessica, even if this is all true, even if you have the worst psychological and verbal abuse, does it ever justify a murder like this? Unless, of course, you take away the self-defense component, if someone is actually trying to defend themselves from a physical attack, just pure psychological and verbal abuse, the worst kind you can imagine. Would it ever justify something like this?
Never. Murder is never justified, ever. This is very sad, absolutely. I don't think the defense is trying to say it's justifiable at all. I think they're trying to say that she didn't know right from wrong at the time of the killing, or at least that's what they're trying to prove. And again, these insanity defenses, they're so complex. You need an expert. You have to rely on the defendant which we don't trust, right? Which we think, I think America, the jury, they think that this is fake.
Well, what is battered child syndrome? We've heard of battered wife syndrome, but how does that really play into a legal framework?
Well, I mean, I think it's not justifying anything. I think it's just an explanation to what drove this child, what broke her reasoning, her rationale at that time. So you have to explain the whole history to get to what happened to her that day. I think that I love the defense saying that, jury, you're not here to determine how this abuse affected the brother. And in reality, what I'm thinking she's saying, we're not here for you to determine how any abuse would affect you.
Right.
It's how it affected this young person, this woman here. It's very particular that we have to look at the defense. So I thought that was a very good line. Again, because I don't believe the insanity. I mean, not that I don't believe it, but it's rarely used. It's rarely successful. So I'm not surprised.
Well, let's see how they did. I mean, maybe you weren't convinced by that first part of the defense's closing argument. Let's continue on because they had more that they wanted this jury to hear. Okay, well, that didn't work. All right, that didn't work. The jury didn't believe that, but they did raise an interesting question, and they did deliberate for 12 hours. So they were wrestling with this issue. The fact that the defense attorney had Nicole's picture out there as she's speaking, you thought that was a good strategy?
Well, yes and no. They have Nicole there, so.
But you look different in that photo.
I think for sure, and I think it was the strategy that I know what you see. I know that you're thinking, or if you're listening to the state, she was rational, she was calm. But look at her. Look at this picture. She looks disheveled. She looks like she's scared. It's nothing what you have seen or what you've heard, that this woman was cool and calm and talked to her friends and was able to talk to her brother and was able to say goodbye. I'm going to be away for a while. I'm not a monster. So I think absolutely it was a strategy. Again, it didn't work.
It didn't work. And why didn't it work? Because at the same point, you could look at somebody and say, maybe she didn't have her capacities there. And somebody that did this, she might have been warped up in a fantasy world. And that's what they tried to express in a way. What do you think was missing?
Again, I just think that the insanity defense is very difficult to prove.
And jurors are skeptical the minute it stops.
Jurors are so skeptical. I think us as a society, we're skeptical because we think that she's faking it and she's going to avoid trial. And I think it's also the most difficult is that we see somebody that's coherent and can speak in complete sentences. And I think that a lot of us think if you're crazy, you're not going to be able to speak in complete sentences. And of course, she committed a murder. You would think that someone is not going to be calm. Again, our notions of what is crazy, what looks crazy, what is insane. So I think a lot of it is our own psychological, mental reasoning that we have, that we bring to the table as humans and as juries. So I think it's always a very difficult, especially if you haven't had a prior diagnosis.
What happens to Nicole next? I mean, for somebody like her, somebody who was convicted of these crimes, there is a mental health component to this. Now spending the rest of her life in prison, what happens to a person like this?
She's going to have a very difficult time in prison. We know that prisons, they don't have the best care for any of their prisoners. We don't agree with that because they shouldn't have it, I guess, is they're found guilty of committing a murder. So it's going to be very difficult for sure. I'm sure she's going to have some mental evaluations to see what is needed and what pod and what floor they're going to put the prisoners with mental difficulties. But she's going to be in regular prison. It's going to be very difficult.
Absolutely. And listen, as you said, nothing justifies murdering 2 people there in cold blood. Really awful crime. We'll have an opportunity to talk more about this case later on. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to switch gears and focus on a major legal story both here and in Sweden, A$AP Rocky. We'll be right back.